Hello and welcome to Political Capital, the intersection of money and power. My name is Karabo Letlhatlha. Is there a method to the madness, or is foreign policy just driven by politics of expediency? How far has South Africa come from the liberal ideals of Nelson Mandela that form part of our outlook on the world? And what anchors the country's foreign policy right now? We discuss South Africa's foreign policy outlook with a snapshot of the last 25 years. Later on in the show, the three branches of government, out of them, Judiciary came out least unscathed from the 9 years of the Jacob Zuma government. But what does that mean for holding power to account? Chief Justice Mogoeng discusses the administration of justice in troubled times. But first, this year marks the third time that South Africa serves as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. But what anchors the country's foreign policy, and is the country using its power and influence to better the continent? Aditi Lalbahadur, Foreign Policy Program Manager at the South African Institute of International Affairs, joins me now. Aditi, I thank you for your time. Aditi, is there a method to the madness that is South African foreign policy? And how far are we from what Nelson Mandela had in mind?
I think definitely there is an enduring sense amongst whoever you speak to that South African foreign policy is incoherent. There's no predictability to it. And so there's justification for that perception. However, I think there have been attempts to try and codify South African foreign policy. There's a white paper that was published in 2011 that kind of spells out very broadly the parameters of our foreign policy. Having said that, I don't think that it is strategic and specific enough to be able to, sort of cater to the need for some sense of predictability. As far as how far it is from the time of Nelson Mandela, I think we would probably say that there's been a difference in nuance because of the different presidencies rather than a difference in policy necessarily.
How much of South African foreign policy is driven by the incumbent being the president? And I'll tell you why I ask this. I think of Nelson Mandela, and I think South Africa in the early 90s, very idealistic in its foreign view, and also what should happen on the continent. Then we might have overshot our importance on that regard. Thabo Mbeki, I think his foreign policy was more Africa-driven and putting Africa on the map. Jacob Zuma, I remember the Omar al-Bashir incident. How much of the incumbent drives the foreign policy of the country?
Jacob Zuma is also BRICS and sort of an increasing policy towards looking at China. I think that's what I said. I think it's when you're talking about South African foreign policy, you see the sort of broad strokes. There are certain consistencies in terms of the fact that we have always pursued a multilateral foreign policy agenda, which means that we've always, whether it's Thabo Mbeki, who tried to sort of to introduce an African Union, transform the Southern African Development Community to the SADC as we know it now. Under Jacob Zuma, it was BRICS. Under President Mandela, it was more sort of re-engaging with the UN and so on. That sense of multilateralism endures. It's just actually what the nuance is determined by the president in power.
Okay, part of why we remember Omar al-Bashir is that he really was an inciting incident in the movement of our foreign policy. At one stage, we were leaving the ICC because we had failed to arrest him while he was in South Africa. And we had a new president, and all of a sudden we were rethinking our initial intention to withdraw from the ICC. That doesn't sound like policy. It doesn't even sound like the same ruling party to me.
Well, I think actually if you actually interrogate that position, you'll see a very interesting nuance, and I think you're going to be discussing it later on in your show, about the different arms of government and the different responsibilities of different institutions. So the decision to sort of rethink South Africa's decision to withdraw from the ICC actually came about from a High Court decision, which actually ruled that it was unconstitutional
and irrational for government.
So that kind of forced South Africa back into the position of saying, okay, we need to rethink our sort of unilateral decision to withdraw from the Rome Treaty. And there's been several instances in the past where that's actually occurred, where courts have actually played a role in determining domestic and even foreign policy. So the most, I think, famous example for a South African, for every South African, is the issue of the treatment action campaign and the rollout of antiretrovirals. That their sort of court petition actually led to the Mbeki administration sort of issuing out ARVs for everyone. So there are lots of instances of that, and I think it speaks to some level the robustness of South Africa's democratic institutions.
Zimbabweans who would be watching the show right now would be thinking, what is South Africa's foreign policy? You know, if nothing else, then to its immediate neighbor. We have seen one foreign policy with regards to Zimbabwe under the Thabo Mbeki administration that is, well, much criticized by Zimbabweans themselves. And they really didn't see any movement when it comes to the Jacob Zuma administration. What should be our foreign policy on the continent, considering that we sided with the West? That's how Africa remembers us, that we, under the Jacob Zuma administration, sided with the Western powers when they wanted to topple the Libyan government. The question is, are we serving our interest at all on the continent? Have we achieved anything through our foreign policy administration? I
think that you're tackling several very important issues, but possibly the one most important issue is actually what is South Africa's interest. We've been engaging with government at various levels around the 25-year review. We're going to be 25 years old in April. And so I think there's a lot of introspection from a government perspective on what have we achieved in the 25 years. And consistently the message that comes across is that we need to be gearing all our policies towards, particularly our foreign policy, towards our national interest. What is that? And that's a very interesting question, because I don't think anybody has a real answer to that question.
And seeing what we are currently seeing, which is some of the ANC's top leadership going to hold discussions with some of ZANU-PF ruling elites. You wonder, isn't this just the liberation brotherhood conversations going on? Because they don't include any of the discerning voices. They don't include NGOs. They don't include opposition. So is Africa beholden to those that liberated it? And can we use foreign policy to move from that position?
Absolutely not. I think that I think what we do need to. I don't want to justify the decision.
The mess that is Zimbabwe. Really, I mean, we're not using any of our effort. Not economic, not political. We might as well be just the front row observer. That's what we are.
I mean, I think we spoke earlier, and I actually said to you, I think there's different actors play different roles in pursuit of foreign policy, and I think there is a special role for liberation movements. Who have a sense of solidarity with each other, to be able to speak to each other about the challenges they face. There's an overarching sense, I think, in Southern Africa, the way in which politics is conducted by governments in Southern Africa, that there is a solidarity. There is a sort of that enduring quiet diplomacy that became so infamous under President Mbeki actually does sort of remain. And so a liberation party like the ANC speaking to its compatriot ZANU I wouldn't see it necessarily as something that is reinforcing the established status quo. What it does, I think, is it is a different avenue for which South Africa can engage with Zimbabwe.
All right, that's diplomacy, and you speak like somebody who's studying foreign policy. To a Zimbabwean, what's changed, really? Is there the nuance? Is it felt on the street?
Exactly. And I think that is the real problem with the way in which we articulate and sort of roll out our foreign policy, is that there is very justifiably so a sense that governments in Southern Africa or governments in Africa tend to see for themselves, to look out for themselves, rather than actually try to further the agenda of democracy, further the agenda of human rights. I mean, the egregious violence that has taken place in Zimbabwe over the past few weeks, what recourse does ordinary Zimbabweans have? Under the SADC protocol, there was the SADC tribunal that would have actually allowed citizens to take their grievance to a regional court. And that is no longer an avenue. So where do ordinary Zimbabweans go? And I think that's a real problem. Where do ordinary Congolese go, for instance? To sort of air their grievances. There has to be, I think, a reorientation of South Africa's foreign policy to be able to say, these are the values that we stand for. We stand for democracy. We stand for human rights. We stand for, sort of human security, which is actually a fundamental tenet of the Southern African development community.
I'm going to argue something, Aditi.
Okay, sure.
I'm going to argue that South Africa has never, it hasn't actually for a long time, maybe since the Libya situation, hasn't led as a sovereign state in terms of administering foreign policy on the continent. I will argue that even the DRC election was through SADC's intervention rather than South Africa using and wielding its own power and influence, if it will.
Yeah.
With that said, are we saying that we are not going to do something as a sovereign state that will only administer it as a body like SADC, like ECOWAS and the likes? But more than anything else, I mean, that was just, we touched on Zimbabwe, but when you look at Sudan right now, the Sudanese are up in arms as we speak. They would like to see the end of Omar al-Bashir's tenure. We could have ended it here in 2015 when he visited, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, I think you've hit the nail on the head. South Africa increasingly is, and it actually does state this, it places a primacy on multilateralism. So that means that most of its decisions will actually take place through a multilateral forum. So you very rarely have I seen South Africa position itself in a way that's different to a SADC pronouncement. And actually the DRC case recently with elections, where the African Union made one pronouncement on election results and SADC made a separate one, was the first time actually I've witnessed that there was even that sort of difference in opinion between the two regional bodies. So it, I mean, I would say that the way South Africa has tried to engage with Zimbabwe and even on the DRC is bilaterally, but it's always behind the scenes. There's a sense of don't air your dirty laundry. I think there's now an increasing sense that that kind of approach is no longer serving South African interests. It's no longer serving the government, because it's promoting the idea that we are entrenching like injustices in the region.
World.
Yeah.
And part of the opportunity loss, especially when you and I look at Sudan, I think we must take responsibility. In closing, 30 seconds, what would you like to see South Africa's foreign policy being, and how active should it be on the continent? I mean, should we always be the last to intervene?
I mean, I think that South Africa really actually has to recapture the values that we stand for. I think it's really entrenched in our constitution. It is about
those values have gotten muddled up.
Exactly.
They're very roiled up, especially after the back of the Jacob Zuma government.
And I think that, I mean, we're in the political and economic space that we are in as well. South Africa very much needs to recapture those in order to be able to find a sense of identity, find a sense of hope. And I think that's intrinsically linked really to an open discussion around what is our national identity, what is our national interest. And that will then help focus how we go about engaging in Africa, how we go about representing ourselves in the world.
Aditi Lalbahadur, thank you very much. Foreign Policy Program Manager at the South African Institute of International Affairs.